Thank you for joining us for a look at the life of Tutankhamun. Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel for more sleep stories. Your support means the world to us. Now lie back and dim the lights as you join us on this journey through the life of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was born into one of the most dramatic and unstable periods in the long story of ancient Egypt. His very birth came at a time when the land was torn between old traditions and radical change, and his short life would become caught between these forces. He came into the world around 1341 BC, during the later years of the 18th dynasty, a dynasty known for its wealth, power, and influence across the ancient world. His father was most likely Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king who abandoned the worship of the many gods of Egypt and declared that only one god, the Aten, the visible sun disk, should be worshipped. His mother was most likely a lesser-known wife or consort, possibly one of Akhenaten's sisters, as evidence from DNA testing on royal mummies has suggested close kinship between them. In this tangled web of royal bloodlines, Tutankhamun was born into a family where politics, religion, and personal ambition were deeply entangled. The Egypt that welcomed Tutankhamun into life was in upheaval. Akhenaten had built a new capital city called Akhetaten, which is now known as Amarna, far from the traditional centers of power at Thebes and Memphis. In this city the king devoted himself to the Aten, breaking with centuries of religious tradition that had sustained Egypt's priests and its people. The temples of the great gods, above all Amun, were closed, their wealth stripped and their priests stripped of influence. For ordinary Egyptians, this must have been deeply confusing, even unsettling, since religion had always been the foundation of daily life, with countless gods tied to the rhythms of the Nile, the harvest and the family. To see these gods suddenly declared powerless, their names erased from monuments, their temples abandoned, was an extraordinary break in continuity. It is into this strange new religious order that Tutankhamun first opened his eyes. His childhood in the palace at Amarna would have been a mix of splendor and fragility. Royal children lived in luxury, surrounded by servants, tutors, and guards, yet the survival of infants in ancient Egypt was never guaranteed. Diseases could strike without warning, and even the protection of wealth could not always hold back fate. Tutankhamun appears to have been a frail child from the beginning. Modern studies of his remains show evidence of deformities in his feet, cleft palate, and signs of malaria, suggesting that health was a struggle for him from birth. Yet as the son of a pharaoh, even a controversial one, his path was shaped by power and destiny. His name at first was Tutankhaten, meaning the living image of Aten, a reflection of the religious devotion of his father to the sun disk. Education for a royal child would have been rigorous. He would have been taught to read and write hieroglyphs, though often the work of writing was left to trained scribes, and he would have been trained in religious rituals, in the arts of diplomacy, and in the basics of military skill. Chariots, bows, and ceremonial weapons were part of a young prince's training, even if his own health may have prevented him from mastering them fully. More than practical skill, it was about projecting the image of the future king as a warrior, a protector, and a divine figure chosen by the gods. His tutors would have reminded him again and again that he was not just a boy but a son of the sun god, born to uphold Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order and justice, against the forces of chaos. Family life at Amarna was complicated. Akhenaten had several wives, including the famous Nefertiti, whose beauty was immortalized in one of the most iconic sculptures from ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun's mother does not seem to have been Nefertiti, which places him in an uncertain position within the royal household. The evidence suggests his mother may have been Kia, another of Akhenaten's wives, or possibly an unnamed royal sister. The family ties were so close that later generations would suffer from the consequences of inbreeding, and Tutankhamun's own physical frailty was likely a result of this. Yet despite such complexities, as a prince of the blood he remained a potential heir, one of the few surviving males of his line. The Amarna court must have been a strange place for a child. Instead of statues of Amun and Osiris, the walls were covered with rays of the Aten reaching down to the royal family, each ray ending in a tiny hand offering the symbol of life. The king and queen were shown not as distant and godlike, but in scenes of intimacy, kissing their children, riding together in chariots, eating beneath the light of the sun. This was a radical departure from the usual art of Egypt, which preferred timeless and formal images. Tutankhamun would have grown up surrounded by these scenes, absorbing the message that his father and the Aten were one, and that his own life was bound to this god above all others. Yet this was not the vision shared by the majority of Egypt, and the tension between royal faith and popular belief grew stronger each year. When Tutankhamun was still very young, his father died, or possibly abdicated, leaving Egypt in a state of uncertainty. The throne may have passed briefly to a figure known as Smenkhkare, whose identity is still debated, perhaps a brother or even Nefertiti under a different name. What is clear is that within a short time, Tutankhamun, barely more than a child, was elevated to the role of pharaoh. He may have been only 8 or 9 years old when he was crowned. It was an extraordinary burden for someone so young, yet he was not alone. Behind him stood powerful advisors, including the Vizier I, a man with long experience in the court, and the General Horemheb, a soldier of great ambition. Together they would guide the boy king, shaping policy and securing their own power while ruling in his name. The coronation itself would have been a dazzling spectacle, held either in Thebes or Memphis, amid the chanting of priests, the scent of incense, and the glitter of gold. The boy who had been Tutankhaten now took a new name, Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of Amun. This was not a small change, but a statement of intent. It marked the return to the old gods, the re-establishment of the cult of Amun, and the beginning of the dismantling of his father's legacy. For the people of Egypt, it must have felt like the restoration of stability, the return of a world that had seemed upside down. For the boy himself, it was the start of a reign that would last less than a decade, yet echo down through thousands of years. Tutankhamun's early years on the throne were guided more by his elders than by his own hand. I and Horemheb ensured that the temples of the old gods were reopened, their treasures restored, and their priests given power once more. This reversal of policy was swift and decisive, and it gave the young king popularity, for the people had never embraced Aten as their only god. Yet the scars of the Amarna period remained, with temples destroyed, traditions disrupted, and the memory of Akhenaten cursed by later generations. Tutankhamun became the symbol of renewal, a boy king who brought back the blessings of the gods, even if in truth he was only a child learning to walk the line between divine image and human fragility. As he grew older, Tutankhamun would have been groomed more actively for his role. He was married to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, and one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their union was as much about political stability as about family ties, bringing together different strands of the royal bloodline and presenting a united face to the people. The two were close in age, both little more than children when they wed, and the evidence from art suggests they shared affection. Scenes on furniture and ornaments from his tomb show the young couple in tender poses, the queen supporting the king offering gifts to the queen, a rare glimpse of intimacy in the stiff formality of royal art. Yet the weight of dynastic duty pressed heavily on them, for they needed to produce heirs to secure the line. For Tutankhamun, adolescence was a time of both splendor and challenge. He lived in palaces decorated with golden furniture, surrounded by servants, musicians, and guards, yet his health was fragile, and he likely suffered from pain and difficulty walking. He may have relied on walking sticks, many of which were found in his tomb, some worn from use. The demands of kingship required appearances of strength, and so he was shown in art riding chariots, hunting and smiting enemies, images that spoke more to tradition and propaganda than to reality. Behind these images was a boy striving to live up to expectations set by centuries of divine kingship, yet often limited by his body. The Egypt that Tutankhamun inherited was powerful, but in need of careful management. Its empire stretched far, and its wealth was the envy of its neighbors, yet internal divisions and external threats required attention. As pharaoh, even a boy, he was the focus of loyalty, the embodiment of the state, the one who upheld the balance between gods and men. Every ritual, every decree, every public appearance carried symbolic weight. In such a world, the life of Tutankhamun, though short, was larger than life, a thread woven into the grand fabric of Egyptian history. His origins, marked by the chaos of his father's reign and the fragile hope of restoration, set the stage for the rest of his story, a story that would end in mystery yet never fade from memory. When Tutankhamun took the throne, he was still a child, not yet able to rule in his own right, and the burden of kingship fell heavily on the shoulders of his advisors. The boy who had once been Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, was now Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, and this shift in name was more than just words. It was a declaration to the people that the old ways would be restored, that the temples of the gods would rise again, and that Egypt would be returned to the traditions that had been broken during the years of Akhenaten. For a boy not yet in his teens, this was not a choice, but a destiny carved by those who surrounded him. Yet his very presence on the throne carried symbolic weight. He was the child king who stood as a bridge between the upheaval of Amarna and the order of Egypt reborn. The coronation of Tutankhamun would have been a dazzling spectacle, even though he was so young. Priests clad in white linen would have carried sacred emblems through the processional ways of Thebes, the sound of sistrums and drums filling the air as incense rose to the heavens. The boy would have been seated on the golden throne, his head heavy beneath the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, while the assembled nobles and officials bowed before him. The ritual words would have spoken of him as a god on earth, chosen by the gods to uphold Maat, the balance of truth and order, against the chaos that always threatened Egypt. Though he was too young to understand the full meaning of the ceremony, he would have been aware of the weight of expectation pressing down upon him, the gaze of the court, the priests, and the people fixed upon his small frame. In reality, the running of the kingdom was not in the hands of the boy, but in those of his closest advisors. Chief among them was the vizier, a man of long service who had risen through the ranks of the court, and who likely had family ties to the royal line. I was skilled, ambitious, and careful, and he understood how to steer Egypt through troubled waters. At his side was Horemheb, the commander of the army, a soldier of great ability who would later become pharaoh himself. Together I and Horemheb provided stability, guiding the boy king and ensuring that the machinery of state continued to function. Their influence was immense, but they needed Tutankhamun as the face of their authority, for only a son of the royal line could stand as the living god upon the throne. The first years of Tutankhamun's reign were marked by the gradual undoing of his father's reforms. Akhenaten's dream of the Aten had left Egypt weakened. The great temples of Amun, Osiris, Ptah, and the other gods had been stripped of wealth and power. The priests, once central to the life of the people, had been cast aside. Cities like Thebes had been left to decline, while the new capital at Amarna was built from the ground up. To the common people, this had felt like a world turned upside down. Now, under the boy king, the old gods were brought back. Temples were reopened, festivals revived, statues restored, and the names of the gods once more carved upon the walls. The young pharaoh, though still a child, became the figurehead of this return to tradition, and his name, Tutankhamun, proclaimed it to all. Life in the palace must have been a strange mixture of splendor and constraint. As king, he was surrounded by servants, guards, musicians, and scribes, and he lived in golden halls where painted walls showed scenes of triumph and order. Yet as a child, his movements were directed by others, his education shaped by tutors, his public appearances arranged to project an image of confidence and power. He would have been taught how to perform the rituals of kingship, how to make offerings to the gods, how to sit upon the throne with the calm stillness expected of a divine ruler. His marriage to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, brought him a companion of his own age within this world of ceremony and duty. Their bond, though shaped by politics, seems to have carried genuine closeness, for art from his tomb later shows them in tender poses, her hand upon his arm, his hand offering her gifts. Even at this young age, the image of Tutankhamun as king had to be carefully managed. In paintings and carvings he was shown smiting enemies, driving his chariot, and hunting animals, just as earlier pharaohs had been shown. These images told the people that the king was strong, that he was the protector of Egypt, that he was a warrior and a hunter in the service of the gods. Whether he was able to do these things in reality mattered less than the image itself. His health was weak, as later evidence has shown, and he may not have been able to perform such feats with ease. But the people did not see his frailty. They saw the golden image of their king standing triumphant over chaos, and that was what mattered. The advisors around Tutankhamun understood that stability was more than just restoring temples. Egypt's empire stretched across lands in the Near East, and it was vital to maintain order there too. Letters from this time show that foreign rulers sought aid and support from Egypt, some even complaining that supplies of gold had slowed during the years of Akhenaten. Horemheb, as commander of the army, would have been central to ensuring that Egypt's borders were secure, that tribute continued to flow, and that the prestige of Egypt remained high. Tutankhamun himself, though only a boy, was presented as the one who upheld Egypt's power abroad, his name attached to decrees and monuments that proclaimed his strength. Within Egypt, the restoration of the old ways must have brought relief. Festivals that had been abandoned under Akhenaten were revived. The great procession of Amun during the Opet festival once more wound through the streets of Thebes, with crowds cheering as the sacred bark was carried from Karnak to Luxor. The people who had felt cut off from their gods were welcomed back into the rhythm of sacred time, and the boy king was at the center of it all, a living symbol that the gods had not abandoned Egypt. Priests who had been cast aside returned to positions of influence, their power once more entwined with that of the throne. Tutankhamun himself must have grown more aware of his role as he entered his teenage years. The crown, once too heavy for a child's head, now sat more firmly upon his brow. The rituals he had been taught were now performed with greater understanding. Yet at the same time his health would have been a constant shadow. Walking was difficult, and he may have suffered pain. Yet he still had to project the image of the divine ruler. The tension between his private reality and his public image must have been great, but such was the nature of kingship in Egypt. The pharaoh was more than a man. He was Horus made flesh, the son of Ra, the chosen of Amun, and no weakness could be shown. The bond with Ankhesenamun would have deepened during these years. As his wife and queen, she stood beside him in ceremony, her presence reinforcing the image of stability and continuity. She too was young, and her life had been shaped by the upheavals of her father's religious reforms. Yet with Tutankhamun, she shared a return to tradition. Their attempts to produce an heir were tragically unsuccessful, as evidence from the tomb later revealed, with two stillborn daughters buried alongside their father. The loss would have been both a personal grief and a political worry, for the future of the dynasty depended on children, yet fate did not grant them. Despite his youth and frailty, Tutankhamun's reign began to leave marks upon the land. He ordered monuments built and temples restored. At Karnak, statues of Amun rose again, their names and faces no longer defaced. In Memphis, the traditional seat of kingship in the north, work was done to reaffirm the presence of the pharaoh. His name was inscribed on stela that declared the restoration of the gods, the repair of temples, and the renewal of offerings. These inscriptions tell us not of a boy hesitating, but of a king declaring that order had been restored, that the gods were pleased, that Egypt was whole again. Whether the words were written by his own command or by his advisors matters less than the effect they had upon the people who read them. The image of Tutankhamun as a strong and capable ruler was carefully fostered. Yet behind the golden mask was still a boy becoming a man under enormous pressure. His court was filled with intrigue, as Eye and Horemheb balanced their own ambitions while guiding the throne. Priests regained their influence, and noble families jostled for favor. The pharaoh himself was both central and at times almost peripheral, the symbol through which others exercised power. Yet without him, without the royal blood that flowed in his veins, their authority would have been far weaker. As he moved through his teens, Tutankhamun must have grown into his role, learning how to preside over court ceremonies, how to receive ambassadors, how to listen to petitions, how to give judgment in disputes. He was not a mere puppet, but a king in training, one who was expected to carry the full weight of kingship as he matured. The years ahead promised the chance for him to step out from the shadow of his advisors and take command in his own right. For the moment, however, he remained a young pharaoh whose reign was shaped by those around him, a symbol of renewal in a land that longed for stability. The burden of the throne at such a young age was immense. Tutankhamun's very existence was bound up in expectation. He was the son of a heretic king, yet he was tasked with restoring the faith. He was a boy of fragile health, yet he was expected to embody strength. He was surrounded by ambitious men, yet he had to stand as their master. In every gesture, every appearance, every carved image, the weight of Egypt's history pressed upon him. He was Pharaoh, living God, and no matter his age or his weakness, he carried upon his shoulders the fate of a civilization that had already stood for 2,000 years. The story of his reign was only just beginning, but already it carried the themes that would define his life: fragility and splendor, weakness and divine power, youth and immense responsibility. Tutankhamun was both a child and a king, both vulnerable and exalted, both a symbol of hope and a reminder of the fragility of life. The throne of Egypt was never an easy seat, but for a boy thrust into its splendor and its weight, it was a burden that would shape every moment of his short life. The reign of Tutankhamun entered its next stage when the religious heart of Egypt was turned once more toward the old gods. His father's vision of Aten as the sole god had been powerful in its way, but it had left the land divided and uncertain. The priests who had once served in temples across Egypt had been stripped of their influence. The names of the gods had been erased from monuments. Great festivals that bound the people to the divine order had been abandoned. In the eyes of the population, Egypt's prosperity and harmony were tied to the balance known as Maat, and Maat depended on the gods being honored. For a child king to stand at the center of this return to tradition carried enormous significance. Tutankhamun, guided by Ea and Horemheb, set his reign on a path of restoration. The first act of importance was the reopening of the temples. Priests who had once been pushed aside returned to their duties, bringing sacrifices of bread, wine, beer, and meat to the altars of Amun, Osiris, Ptah, and countless others. Incense once more filled the great halls, and processions carried sacred images through the streets. This was not just a matter of religion, but of politics, for the priests were among the most powerful men in Egypt, and their loyalty was vital for the stability of the throne. By restoring their wealth and their influence, the court ensured that the boy king was surrounded by allies who would proclaim that the gods themselves favored him. The change in Tutankhamun's name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun was a public declaration of this shift. Where once he had been the living image of Aten, now he was the living image of Amun, the great god of Thebes, whose cult had dominated Egypt for centuries before Akhenaten's revolution. This new name was not merely symbolic. It was carved on monuments, written in decrees, and spoken in festivals. Each time it was repeated, it told the people that Egypt was whole again, that their king was blessed by the gods they had always known, and that the strange years of Aten's supremacy were being swept away. The city of Amarna, built by Akhenaten as his sacred capital, quickly lost its importance. Though it had been filled with grand palaces and temples to the Aten, its very foundations were a reminder of the heresy that had so divided the land. Tutankhamun and his court shifted focus back to Thebes and Memphis, the traditional centers of kingship. Thebes, with its towering temples of Karnak and Luxor, became once more the spiritual heart of the nation. Memphis, near the Nile Delta, remained the political hub, a place where the king could show his presence to both the southern and northern regions of Egypt. Amarna faded into the sands, left as a ghost of a dream that had lasted little more than a generation. The restoration of the old gods was more than a return to the past. It was also a political strategy designed to unify the kingdom. The people had always felt connected to their gods, whether in the form of household shrines to Bez and Tauret, or through the great festivals that brought the community together. When these traditions had been cast aside, it was as though the rhythm of life had been broken. Now, under Tutankhamun, the rhythms were restored. The Opet festival once more filled the streets of Thebes with music and prayer. The beautiful feast of the valley returned, when families honored their ancestors and carried offerings to the west bank of the Nile. These festivals reminded the people that the gods were present, that the world was in balance, and that their young king stood as the one who held it all together. The court made sure that these acts of restoration were remembered. Stelae were carved and set up across the land, declaring that the king had repaired the temples, restored the offerings, and brought the gods back to their rightful places. These inscriptions spoke of a land renewed, of peace returned, of blessings flowing once more from the heavens. Though they were the work of scribes and priests, they were issued in the name of Tutankhamun, giving him credit for deeds that may have been guided by others. For the people who read them, or who heard them read aloud, the message was clear. The boy king was not just a ruler in name. He was the chosen one who had restored harmony to Egypt. This restoration had an impact on every level of society. Farmers in the Nile Valley felt reassured that their harvests would be blessed by the gods. Craftsmen saw temples come alive again, with commissions for statues, jewelry, and sacred vessels. Priests regained their authority and were once more respected figures within their communities. The court itself gained stability, for the support of the temples meant that the throne was shielded by divine approval. In every way the young pharaoh was presented as the savior of Egypt, even if in truth he was only beginning to understand the weight of his crown. Religious propaganda played a central role in these years. Temples displayed images of the boy king, making offerings to Amun, Ra, and Ptah. Reliefs showed him smiting enemies in the presence of the gods. Even the smallest amulets bore his name linked with divine power. The image of Tutankhamun was everywhere, not as the fragile youth he truly was, but as the strong and favored ruler who held Egypt in balance. This image was carefully crafted, yet it worked, for in the eyes of the people the return of the gods coincided with the reign of the young king, and that was enough. The priests of Amun in particular gained from this restoration. Their temple at Karnak had long been one of the greatest centers of wealth in Egypt. Under Akhenaten they had been stripped of their resources, their statues defaced, their names erased. Now, under Tutankhamun, their power surged back. Offerings of land, cattle, gold, and goods flowed into the temple once more, and the priests stood as guardians of divine order. Their support of the king in return was absolute, for it was he who had restored them. This alliance between throne and temple would shape the rest of the dynasty, and it placed Tutankhamun firmly in the line of kings who ruled with the gods at their side. For Tutankhamun himself, the restoration of the gods meant that his own life became even more bound to ritual. Each day he would be expected to take part in ceremonies, to present offerings, to stand in the presence of statues and images of the gods, and to embody their favor. These acts were not empty forms. They were believed to be essential for the survival of Egypt itself. Without the king to serve as the link between gods and men, the world could descend into chaos. Though he was young and weak in body, Tutankhamun had to stand in this role, his presence alone enough to reassure the people that Maat was preserved. The world outside Egypt looked upon these changes with interest. Foreign rulers who had once seen Egypt turn inward during the Amarna years now saw signs of renewed strength. Letters found in archives such as the Amarna letters show that kings of neighboring lands watched closely, asking for gold, alliances, and aid. Egypt's image as the great power of the region was tied not just to its armies, but also to its stability at home. The return of the gods under Tutankhamun told the world that Egypt was once more secure and united. The young king's image as a restorer became so strong that even centuries later scribes remembered him in this way. Though his reign was short and his achievements limited by his early death, the fact that he had brought back the old gods ensured that his name was carved into history. In some accounts, later rulers tried to erase his memory, perhaps because they wished to take credit for his acts, yet the discovery of his tomb thousands of years later would prove that his image as the restorer never truly vanished. For the people of Egypt at the time, what mattered most was that life felt steady again. The Nile continued to flood, the crops continued to grow, the temples rang once more with hymns, and the festivals returned to their rightful place in the calendar. Tutankhamun was a child, but he was their king, and he was the one who, in their eyes, had brought the gods back to them. His face on statues and stelae showed not weakness, but divine favor. And in this image the people placed their trust. The years of restoring the gods were not simply about faith. They were also about rebuilding confidence in the throne itself. Kingship in Egypt was never just a political role. It was sacred, tied to the gods in every aspect. Akhenaten had broken this bond, making himself the sole priest of the Aten, cutting off the people from their traditions. Tutankhamun, by restoring the gods, also restored the image of kingship as a shared link between ruler, gods and people. This was perhaps his greatest achievement, though it was guided by those who advised him. Tutankhamun's reign at this stage showed the deep resilience of Egyptian culture. Even after a decade of upheaval, the traditions of thousands of years could be brought back with force. The people had never fully abandoned their gods, and now they could worship them openly again. The boy king became the symbol of this resilience, his name forever tied to the act of restoration. In truth, his health was frail, his reign controlled by others, and his life still in its early stages, yet the image of Tutankhamun as the restorer of order was firmly set. The gods were back in their temples, the priests were back in their robes, the festivals were back in their calendars, and at the heart of it all stood a boy whose fragile body carried the weight of eternity. Tutankhamun was both a child and a pharaoh, both a symbol and a man. His role as the one who brought back the gods secured his place in history. And even if his reign would be short, this act alone was enough to echo through the ages. The life of Tutankhamun as pharaoh was not only shaped by gods and temples, but also by the daily world of his palace and the people who surrounded him. While the restoration of religion gave his reign its defining character, the reality of kingship was lived out in the courts, in the company of his queen, his officials, and the servants who attended it to every part of his existence. For all the grandeur of his titles and the splendor of his ceremonies, Tutankhamun was also a boy and later a young man, and his days were filled with routines that mixed the sacred and the ordinary. The palace where Tutankhamun lived was a place of color and light. Painted walls showed images of gardens, ponds, birds, and lotus flowers, reminders of the beauty of the Nile Valley and the order that the king was meant to maintain. Floors were painted with scenes of fish swimming in clear waters, or with patterns of woven reeds. The rooms were cooled with open courtyards and shaded by colonnades, while the air carried the scent of incense and perfume. Servants moved silently through the corridors, bringing food, clothing, and gifts. Musicians played harps and flutes, while dancers entertained during feasts. Though he carried the burdens of kingship, Tutankhamun also lived within this world of luxury, and for a time it must have offered him comfort against the frailty of his body and the weight of expectation. At the center of his life within the palace stood Ankhesenamun, his queen and half-sister. They had been married when they were still children, and as they grew older their bond deepened. She was a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, raised in the same turmoil as Tutankhamun, and together they shared the task of guiding Egypt back to stability. In art they appear side by side, a rare sign of intimacy in the rigid language of Egyptian image-making. On the back of the famous golden throne found in his tomb, Ankhesenamun is shown placing ointment on her husband, a gesture of tenderness that speaks across the centuries. In another scene, she is shown standing before him, receiving flowers from his hand. These images tell of a relationship that carried both affection and duty, a marriage that was not only political but also personal. The queen's role was more than ceremonial. As the great royal wife, she shared in rituals, offered prayers to the gods, and presented herself as the mother of the future line. Her place beside the king reinforced the image of divine order, for in Egyptian belief the union of king and queen echoed the cosmic union of gods. Yet her position was also fraught with pressure. She and Tutankhamun needed to produce heirs, but tragedy struck when two daughters were stillborn. Their small mummified bodies were placed in the tomb with their father, silent witnesses to hopes unfulfilled. This loss must have weighed heavily on both of them, both as a personal sorrow and as a political concern. Without children, the dynasty itself stood on fragile ground, and others at court no doubt watched this closely. Life at court was filled with ceremony, but behind the splendor were constant intrigues. The king was surrounded by advisors, scribes, generals, and priests, each of whom sought influence. The old vizier, moved with quiet skill, guiding decisions while ensuring his own place near the throne. Horemheb, the commander of the army, stood as the protector of Egypt's borders and the leader of its soldiers, a man of action and ambition. Between them they formed the pillars of Tutankhamun's rule, but their rivalry simmered, for both understood that the throne might one day pass to them if the king left no heir. The palace was therefore both a home and a battlefield of hidden politics, where every gesture, every whisper, every gift might carry meaning. For Tutankhamun himself, daily life was structured around both ritual and routine. At dawn, he would be expected to present offerings to the gods, either in person or through appointed priests acting on his behalf. He wore fine linen garments, jewelry of gold and faience, and sandals crafted by skilled artisans. Meals included bread, meat, fruits, and wine, served in golden bowls and cups. The palace kitchens worked constantly to provide not only for the royal family, but also for the endless stream of guests, officials, and foreign envoys who passed through the court. Music and poetry were part of daily entertainment, with hymns praising the king's beauty, strength, and divine nature. Even moments of leisure were shaped by the expectation that the pharaoh was not a man like others, but a god walking among them. Hunting was one of the pursuits expected of a king, and even though Tutankhamun's health was poor, scenes on artifacts show him in a chariot, drawing a bow against wild animals. Whether he truly took part in such hunts, or whether these images were symbolic, is uncertain, but they reinforced the image of the pharaoh as the protector who subdued the forces of chaos. In Egyptian thought, to kill wild beasts or to strike down enemies was to act on behalf of the gods in maintaining order. Even if he could not always perform these acts himself, Tutankhamun was shown doing so, and in the eyes of his people that was enough. Foreign envoys also came to the court, bringing gifts and asking for alliances. Egypt was famed for its gold, and neighboring rulers often wrote letters pleading for shipments of it. Tutankhamun's court responded with diplomacy, maintaining the image of Egypt as the richest and most powerful land in the known world. Chests of gold, fine linen, carved furniture, and jewelry were sent abroad, while in return came exotic animals, rare woods, and luxury goods. These exchanges reinforced the prestige of the throne, and they reminded the people that their king was respected by distant lands. The palace was also a center of art and craft. Skilled workers produced items of extraordinary beauty for the king and queen. Furniture inlaid with ivory, golden shrines covered in scenes of ritual, chariots decorated with hunting images, and jewelry sparkling with semi-precious stones were all created for use in life, and later for burial in death. The objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb reveal the level of care and detail that surrounded him. Even simple items like sandals or walking sticks were crafted with elegance, showing that no part of the king's life was free from splendor. Despite this world of luxury, the reality of Tutankhamun's health could not be ignored. Evidence from his remains shows that he suffered from a club foot, making walking painful and forcing him to rely on canes. Malaria and bone disease may have weakened him further. Yet in the palace he was shielded from the outside world. Servants assisted him, physicians offered treatments, and rituals were performed to call upon the gods for healing. His frailty made his role as a divine symbol even more important, for the image of the king needed to remain unbroken. Where his body failed, art and ritual supplied strength. The relationship between king and queen was also central to life at court. Ankhesemen shared his struggles, and her role may have included caring for his health, as well as standing beside him in ceremony. Their closeness gave stability to the image of the throne. For the people of Egypt, to see their king with his queen was to see the harmony of gods reflected on earth. Together they embodied the hope of continuity, even if their attempts to produce an heir were met with sorrow. The palace was also a stage for feasting and celebration. On great occasions, banquets were held, with long tables piled high with food and wine. Musicians played while dancers entertained, and the king and queen sat beneath canopies adorned with lotus flowers. Nobles and foreign guests attended, offering gifts and pledges of loyalty. These feasts reminded everyone of the wealth and power of the throne, and they reinforced the sense that Tutankhamun was not only a ruler of Egypt, but also the center of a world filled with splendor. Yet for all the grandeur, there was always an undercurrent of fragility. The king's health, the lack of heirs, the ambitions of his advisors, all created a sense of uncertainty that could not be ignored. Within the walls of the palace, life seemed timeless, filled with music, color, and ritual. But outside those walls, the realities of succession and power were never far away. Tutankhamun lived in splendor, but also under a shadow, and those around him must have wondered how long the balance could last. In many ways, the daily life of Tutankhamun reflected the broader truth of Egypt itself. The kingdom was ancient, strong, and filled with tradition, yet it was also vulnerable to the passage of time, to illness, to ambition to change. The boy king embodied both strength and weakness, splendor and fragility, hope and uncertainty. His palace life was filled with beauty, yet behind the golden walls were struggles that no amount of art could fully hide. Still, during these years, Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun gave Egypt a sense of stability. They appeared together in festivals. They presided over court ceremonies. They offered sacrifices to the gods. The people saw their king not as a sickly boy, but as a divine ruler, a restorer of tradition and the heart of their world. The palace life, with all its splendor and ritual, maintained this image, and for a time it worked. Egypt was calm, the gods were honored, and the throne was secure, at least on the surface. The daily world of Tutankhamun was therefore both ordinary and extraordinary. He ate meals, listened to music, spent time with his queen, and endured the pain of illness. Yet he also stood as a god, presided over festivals, received the loyalty of nobles, and held the fate of a civilization in his hands. His palace life was a mirror of his reign, filled with beauty and ritual, yet shadowed by fragility and doubt. It was a world that seemed eternal, yet it was also a world that would end far too soon. The image of Tutankhamun that has reached us across the centuries is often one of splendor and fragility. A boy king who restored the gods, but who lived a short and delicate life. Yet within his reign there are also glimpses of another image, one that shows him as a warrior king, a ruler who took part in campaigns and who was presented as the protector of Egypt in battle. The question of whether he truly fought or whether these images were only symbolic remains debated. But they were part of how his reign was shaped and remembered, and they shed light on how a young king could still embody the power of a great empire. Egypt at the time of Tutankhamun was still one of the strongest kingdoms in the ancient world, but its hold over its empire was not as firm as it once had been. The lands of Syria and Canaan had long been contested, and rival powers, such as the Hittites, were pressing closer to Egypt's borders. Letters from foreign rulers show that vassal states in the Near East sometimes felt neglected during the Amarna period, when Akhenaten had turned his gaze inward toward the Aten. They asked for gold soldiers and support, and some complained that Egypt had not sent help when enemies attacked. When Tutankhamun came to the throne, part of his task was to show the world that Egypt was once again strong, and that its pharaoh was a leader of armies as well as a servant of the gods. Scenes found on the walls of his tomb and on objects buried with him present him as a warrior in the full splendor of pharaonic tradition. One chest, painted with vivid detail, shows the young king riding in his chariot, bow drawn, as he charges into battle against Asiatic enemies. The figures fall before him in chaos, their faces twisted in fear, while the king remains calm and triumphant. On another side of the chest, he is shown smiting Nubian foes, driving his chariot as dark-skinned warriors scatter before his arrows. These images follow a long tradition in Egyptian art, where the pharaoh is shown as the one who crushes Egypt's enemies and restores order to the world. Whether Tutankhamun ever rode into such battles himself is uncertain, but the message was clear. He was not just a child on the throne. He was Horus on earth, the falcon who struck down chaos with divine strength. The weapons found in his tomb support this image. There were bows, arrows, spears, and clubs, all richly decorated with gold and inlays. Several chariots were buried with him, some for ceremonial use, others perhaps for hunting or warfare. These chariots were light and fast, pulled by horses, and they symbolized the speed and power of the king in battle. Walking sticks and canes found in the tomb also show signs of wear, suggesting that he relied on them in daily life. Yet alongside them were weapons and armor that projected an image of a warrior. The contrast between the frailty of the boy and the splendor of the warrior king tells us much about how kingship in Egypt was shaped. Even if the king could not perform every act, he had to be shown as the one who did, for in his image the state and the people found security. The possibility that Tutankhamun may have taken part in some form of campaigning cannot be ruled out. Though his health was poor, Egyptian kings were expected to lead their armies, or at least to be seen doing so. Horemheb, as commander of the army, would have organized military expeditions to maintain Egypt's influence abroad, and it is possible that Tutankhamun was brought along to present himself as leader, even if the real command was in the hands of his general. Reliefs and inscriptions hint at military actions during his reign, including expeditions against Nubians to the south. These campaigns may not have been large-scale wars, but they would have served to remind both Egypt and its neighbors that the pharaoh's arm was strong and that his enemies were defeated. The symbolism of the warrior king was as important as any real battle. For Egyptians, the pharaoh was the one who upheld Ma'at, the balance of the universe, against Isfet, the forces of chaos. Enemies outside Egypt were seen not only as political threats, but also as embodiments of disorder. When the king was shown crushing them beneath his chariot or smiting them with a club, it was more than propaganda. It was a religious image, a ritual act carved in stone and painted on wood, showing that the gods favored Egypt and that order was restored. For Tutankhamun to be shown this way was essential, especially since he had already been presented as the one who restored the gods. Now he was shown as the one who restored Egypt's strength in the world. The chariot scenes also carried personal meaning. Riding in a chariot required skill, balance, and strength. For a king with a club foot and fragile health, it may have been difficult, but chariots could also be adapted, and perhaps he did ride them with assistance. In any case, the image of the young king, standing tall in a chariot, bow in hand, his enemies scattering before him, was a powerful message. It showed him not as weak but as strong, not as fragile but as triumphant. The people of Egypt, seeing such images, would have felt pride and reassurance. Their king, though young, was still the one chosen by the gods to protect them. Weapons themselves carried symbolic power. A bow was not only a tool of war, but a sign of divine favor, for the gods themselves were often shown with bows. The act of drawing a bow against an enemy was both practical and spiritual, a statement that the king acted as the arm of the gods. Spears, axes, and clubs had similar meaning, linked to the rituals of smiting chaos. Tutankhamun's tomb was filled with such objects, and their presence there reminds us that even in death, he was expected to continue the eternal battle against disorder. The burial goods were not only for use in the afterlife, but also a statement to the living about who he was. The question of whether Tutankhamun truly fought or whether he was only shown fighting is one that may never be fully answered. His body shows evidence of weakness, and it is hard to imagine him riding into battle with ease. Yet kingship in Egypt was never about the individual alone. It was about the office, the role, the image. Even if Horemheb led the soldiers, Tutankhamun's presence, his name, his face on the monuments, made the campaigns legitimate. The king was the divine leader, and the generals acted in his name. The victories of Egypt were always presented as the victories of the pharaoh, no matter who planned the battles. Foreign relations during his reign suggest that Egypt was active in diplomacy, as well as war. Letters from the time show exchanges of gifts with other rulers, negotiations for alliances, and demands for gold from Egypt. The presence of Asiatic and Nubian enemies in the art of Tutankhamun's reign shows that Egypt still faced challenges on its borders. But it also shows that Egypt responded with strength. The image of the warrior king was not only for the people of Egypt, it was also for the eyes of foreigners, a warning that Egypt was still powerful and that its young king was no less a force to be reckoned with. For Tutankhamun himself, the warrior image may have been both a comfort and a burden. To be shown as strong and triumphant must have felt empowering, yet he would have known his own frailty. To see himself painted crushing enemies from his chariot while relying on canes to walk may have created a sharp divide between image and reality. Yet in the role of pharaoh, reality mattered less than the eternal image. To his people, he was not just a boy with weak bones. He was the son of Ra, the chosen of Amun, the protector of Egypt. As long as the images showed him as such, that was who he was. The warrior king tradition was one that stretched back centuries to rulers such as Thutmose III and Ramses II, who had carved their victories in stone for all time. Tutankhamun's reign was short and fragile, but he was still inserted into this tradition. By showing him as a conqueror of enemies, his advisors tied him to the great kings of the past and ensured that his name carried weight. Even if he never stood on a battlefield in truth, he stood there in art, and in Egypt art was eternal. The warrior image also connected to his role as hunter. Hunting was a royal pastime that symbolized control over nature and chaos. Scenes show Tutankhamun hunting lions, ostriches, and other animals, riding in his chariot with bow in hand. Whether or not he truly took part, these scenes reinforce the same message as the battle scenes. The king brings order. The king subdues chaos. The king protects Egypt. For the people, the difference between real and symbolic mattered little. What mattered was that their king was shown fulfilling his role. The weapons buried with him also tell us something about how he was remembered. They were not crude tools, but works of art, decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones. Some were inscribed with his name, linking him forever to the power they represented. In the afterlife, he was expected to continue as a warrior, defending himself against enemies and ensuring his eternal rule. The inclusion of so many weapons in his tomb shows that this aspect of his identity was taken seriously, even if his health had made it difficult in life. In the end, Tutankhamun's role as a warrior king may have been more about image than reality, but in Egypt image was reality. The people did not see him limping on a cane. They saw him carved in stone, strong and triumphant. They saw him on painted chests, scattering enemies with arrows. They saw him in temples, smiting chaos before the gods. This was who he was to them, and this was enough. The boy king may have been frail, but the pharaoh was eternal, and as long as the image endured, so did his power. Thus Tutankhamun, the child who restored the gods, was also Tutankhamun, the warrior king, the protector of Egypt, the one who upheld Ma'at against the forces that threatened it. His reign was short, his body was weak, his achievements may have been shaped by others. Yet in the eternal world of Egypt, he was remembered as strong, triumphant, and divine. It is in this image that he takes his place among the kings of Egypt, and it is this image that still speaks to us today from the treasures of his tomb. Tutankhamun's image as a warrior king was powerful, yet behind the golden mask and painted scenes lay the reality of his frail body. His health has long been a subject of fascination, for the evidence preserved in his tomb and later studied by modern science reveals that the young pharaoh struggled with a range of conditions that would have shaped his life and perhaps even shortened it. The splendor of his reign cannot be separated from the fragility of his body, and to understand the boy king fully, we must look closely at the mysteries of his health. When Howard Carter opened the tomb in 1922, the world was dazzled by the treasures that filled the chambers. Gold shrines, jewelry, statues, and furniture poured forth, yet within the nested coffins lay the body of the boy king himself, preserved in layers of resin and linen. The mummy was in poor condition, partly due to the rush of his burial and partly due to damage caused by fire and chemicals during the embalming process. Still, enough remained for scientists to study, and from the first examinations it was clear that Tutankhamun had not been a robust figure. His skeleton showed signs of deformity, and his body seemed more fragile than those of other pharaohs. Later studies with X-rays and CT scans revealed more. His left foot was twisted, with evidence of a club foot, making it difficult or even impossible for him to walk unaided. This explained why so many walking sticks and canes were found in his tomb, more than 100 in total, many showing signs of use. These were not ceremonial props, but practical aids that he relied upon daily. To imagine the young king limping through his palace with the support of a cane gives a very different picture from the triumphant warrior painted on his chariots. Yet this contrast was part of his life, the struggle between reality and image, weakness and power. Evidence also showed that Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate and from scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. His bones were thin and fragile, and signs of bone disease suggested that he lived with chronic pain. DNA testing carried out in the early 21st century revealed the presence of malaria parasites, showing that he endured bouts of fever and weakness caused by the disease. Combined with his other conditions, malaria would have placed a heavy burden on his health, making it difficult for him to carry out the duties of kingship without support. These health problems were likely the result of the close bloodlines within the royal family. The Amarna dynasty, to which Tutankhamun belonged, practiced sibling marriage, a custom rooted in the idea that the royal bloodline was divine and must remain pure. While this gave the throne an aura of sacredness, it also increased the risk of inherited conditions. DNA studies suggest that Tutankhamun's parents were siblings, which would have heightened the chance of genetic disorders. His frailty was thus not only personal, but also the outcome of the dynasty's choices, a reminder of the costs of keeping power within such close bounds. The way Tutankhamun was treated in life must have reflected this reality. Servants would have assisted him in moving around the palace. Chariots may have been adapted for him to ride in, even if he could not handle them fully on his own. Physicians and priests would have been called upon to ease his pain with remedies and rituals. The Egyptian medical tradition was advanced for its time, with knowledge of herbs, poultices, and treatments, yet much of their healing was also tied to spells and prayers to the gods. For the pharaoh, every illness was more than physical. It was also spiritual, for his health reflected the health of the land. If the king was weak, people feared that the gods might be displeased, and so rituals of protection would have been constant in his daily life. The presence of so many walking sticks in his tomb is striking. Some were plain, others decorated with gold and ivory, but together they speak of a man who leaned on them as part of his daily existence. Each cane would have been both a tool and a symbol, for even the simplest object of the king was crafted with beauty. In their wear we see not the image of a god, but the reality of a youth struggling with the act of walking. These canes may have been as much a part of his identity as the crook and flail, the traditional emblems of kingship. The question of how his health shaped his reign is complex. On the one hand, his frailty must have limited his ability to take part in long ceremonies, hunts, or military campaigns. On the other hand, it may have strengthened the role of his advisors, who acted more forcefully in his name. Iron Horemheb may have found greater scope to direct affairs because the young king was not able to assert himself fully. Yet even in weakness, his symbolic role remained strong. The people did not need to see him run or fight. They needed to see him crowned, to see him offer sacrifices, to see him stand as the link between gods and men. In this role, even a frail king could still embody eternity. The study of his body also raised questions about how he died. Some early examinations suggested a blow to the head, leading to theories that he had been murdered. Others pointed to a broken leg, possibly from a fall or an accident. Modern CT scans show that his skull was not fractured in life, but damaged after death, perhaps during embalming. The broken leg, however, seems to have been real, and it may have become infected. Combined with malaria and his other conditions, this injury could have been fatal. Rather than a dramatic murder, Tutankhamun's death may have been the result of illness and accident, a tragic end for a young king already weakened by disease. The condition of his body also shows that his burial was rushed. Resin was poured over the body in such a way that it burned, damaging the mummy. The coffins and shrines, though splendid, were not all made specifically for him, but adapted from others, suggesting that his death came suddenly and left little time for preparation. This hurried burial speaks of a court caught off guard, scrambling to bury the king with honor while managing the crisis of succession. For modern eyes, the picture of Tutankhamun as a frail youth leaning on canes, struck by malaria and deformed by inherited illness, contrasts sharply with the treasures that surrounded him. Yet this contrast is part of what makes his story so compelling. He was both fragile and exalted, weak in body yet strong in image. His health shaped his life, his reign, and his death. Yet it did not prevent him from becoming one of the most famous figures in history. In some ways, the very fragility of his life has added to the fascination, for it shows the human side of kingship, the boy beneath the crown, the child who carried the burden of eternity while struggling with pain. The modern studies of his body also remind us that even the greatest of kings were subject to the same human frailties as their people. Illness, injury, and inherited weakness could touch the divine pharaoh as much as any farmer or servant. The difference was that for Tutankhamun, these struggles were hidden behind the mask of gold and the images of triumph. Only when his tomb was opened did the truth begin to emerge, a truth that made him both more vulnerable and more real. To the people of his time, Tutankhamun was still the image of divine power, and his frailty was not spoken of openly. The priests and scribes presented him as strong and eternal, for that was what the people needed. Yet within the palace, among those who served him daily, his weakness would have been plain. They saw him lean on canes, wince in pain, perhaps collapse in fever. They knew the boy beneath the crown, and they must have wondered how long his body could carry the burden placed upon it. In this way, the mysteries of Tutankhamun's health are not only about science, but also about humanity. They show us a boy who was more than the golden mask, more than the painted chariot scenes, more than the image carved on stone. He was a youth who lived with pain, who relied on the care of others, who faced the same struggles as any human, yet who carried the title of pharaoh, the highest role in his world. His story reminds us that behind every ruler, no matter how exalted, there is a person, fragile and mortal. The study of Tutankhamun's health has changed our understanding of his reign. He was not the robust warrior some imagined, nor the helpless invalid others suggested. He was a boy who lived with frailty, who struggled yet endured, who reigned for nearly a decade despite illness, and who left a mark on history not through conquest or building, but through survival and restoration. His health shaped his life, but it did not define his legacy. The treasures of his tomb, the images of his reign, and the fascination that surrounds his name show that even a fragile body can carry the weight of eternity. The reign of Tutankhamun lasted less than 10 years, and his death came when he was still little more than a boy. The exact age has been debated, but most agree he was around 18 or 19 years old. His sudden passing threw Egypt into uncertainty, for he had no surviving children, and his frail body left behind more questions than answers. The way he died, the hurried nature of his burial, and the struggles that followed have been subjects of debate for centuries, and they continue to shape his story. The young king had already suffered much in his short life. His health was weak, his body twisted and fragile, his days marked by pain and illness. The strain of ruling, even with advisors to guide him, must have been immense. It is easy to imagine how the burden of endless rituals, ceremonies, and public duties weighed on him, when even the simple act of walking could cause suffering. His death, therefore, may have come as little surprise to those closest to him, yet the exact cause remains one of the great mysteries of history. When his tomb was discovered, early studies of his body revealed damage to his skull. Some suggested that he had been struck a blow to the head, perhaps murdered in a palace plot. The story of a young pharaoh cut down by betrayal captured the imagination, and it fitted the image of a court filled with intrigue, where men like I and Horemheb may have eyed the throne. Yet later scans and studies showed that the damage to the skull was likely caused after death, perhaps during embalming when resin was poured over the body and heated, charring the flesh and bone. The murder theory, while dramatic, may have been more myth than fact. Attention then turned to a broken leg. Scans revealed that his left thigh bone had been fractured, with splinters of bone suggesting it was an open wound. Some argued that this break happened shortly before death, and if it became infected, it could have led to sepsis. Combined with malaria and his other health problems, such an infection might have been fatal. How he broke his leg is uncertain. Some suggest a fall from a chariot, others a stumble in the palace, or even an accident while hunting. Whatever the cause, for a boy already weakened, such an injury may have been more than his body could bear. There are also theories that point to a combination of ailments. malaria, bone disease, and congenital deformities may have worn him down over time, making him vulnerable to any accident or illness. In this view, his death was not the result of one dramatic event, but of a lifetime of frailty. His body, burdened from birth by genetic weakness, simply failed. For a boy of such status, with access to the best care of his time, the thought that nothing could save him is both tragic and human. The suddenness of his death is reflected in the way he was buried. Egyptian kings were usually given years to prepare their tombs in the Valley of the Kings, vast chambers cut into the rock, filled with treasures and decorated with scenes of the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb, by contrast, was small, almost cramped, and many of the objects within it seem to have been taken from other burials and repurposed for him. His coffins and shrines were magnificent, yet some bore signs that they had been altered. Even his famous golden mask may have been adapted, with evidence that it was not originally made for him. This suggests that his death came quickly, leaving little time for proper preparation. The rush of his burial can also be seen in the embalming process. Resin was poured so thickly and heated so strongly that it burned the body, leaving it blackened and fragile. This was not the careful preservation usually granted to a pharaoh. It may have been done in haste, or perhaps the priests made an error in their ritual. Either way, the result was a mummy badly damaged, adding to the mystery of his final days. The days after his death must have been filled with fear and uncertainty. The court had lost its king, the gods their chosen link, and the dynasty its fragile hope of an heir. Ankhesenamun, his queen, was left a widow while still a teenager, with no child to secure the line. Her position was perilous, for without a husband or son, her role as queen was at risk, and the men of the court, and Horemheb, were waiting. A letter found in foreign archives tells us something of her desperation. It was sent to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's rivals, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her, for she declared that she had no son and could not marry one of her own servants. This extraordinary plea shows how vulnerable she felt and how uncertain the future of the throne seemed. The Hittite king agreed and sent a prince, but he was murdered on the way to Egypt, perhaps by those who feared foreign influence at the heart of Egypt. This left Ankhesenamun alone, and soon after, she disappears from history. Some believe she was forced to marry A, who became pharaoh after Tutankhamun. Others suggest she was removed from power altogether. Her fate remains as mysterious as that of her young husband, a reminder of how fragile and dangerous life at the Egyptian court could be. The vizier who had long guided the boy king stepped into power swiftly. He conducted the burial of Tutankhamun, taking the role of chief mourner, which was both a religious duty and a political claim. By burying the king, he presented himself as the rightful successor. Yet his reign was short, and after him, Horemheb took the throne, erasing much of the memory of Tutankhamun and I. Horemheb presented himself as the restorer of order, but in truth, it was the boy king who had already begun that work. The mystery of Tutankhamun's death, whether by accident, illness, or intrigue, has fascinated the world because it touches on the fragility of life, even at the highest level. Here was a king surrounded by wealth and splendor, yet he could not escape pain, disease, and death. His end came not with a great battle or a grand building, but in the quiet collapse of a frail body. Yet in this frailty lies part of his power. The treasures of his tomb survived untouched, and when they were uncovered, they revealed the human side of kingship, the boy beneath the crown. For the people of Egypt at the time, his death must have been a shock. The rituals of mourning were carried out, with priests chanting spells to guide him into the afterlife. His body was wrapped in linen, placed within golden coffins, and surrounded by goods for eternity. Chariots, weapons, furniture, food, and even games were placed within the tomb, gifts for the journey beyond. The people may not have known the details of his illness or accident, but they would have seen the end of a reign that had promised renewal. The boy who brought back the gods was gone, and with him went the fragile hope of a stable dynasty. The hurried burial also speaks of fear. A court that had more time would have built a grander tomb, carved deeper into the rock, with more chambers and greater splendor. Instead, Tutankhamun was placed in what may have been a tomb prepared for a noble, adapted quickly to serve as the resting place of a king. This shows how sudden his death was, and how unprepared the court had been. It also reflects the uncertainty of succession, for those who followed were more concerned with securing power than with ensuring the boy king a grand burial. In later years, Tutankhamun's name was largely forgotten. Horemheb and others sought to erase him from history, removing his name from lists of kings. To them, he was part of the Amarna line, a dynasty they wished to bury. Yet fate had other plans. The small tomb, hidden and forgotten, escaped the plunder that struck so many others. When it was uncovered in the modern age, the forgotten boy king became the most famous of them all. His death remains a subject of debate, with each new study offering fresh clues, but never full certainty. Was it accident, illness, or murder? Did he fall from a chariot, break his leg, and succumb to infection? Did malaria strike him down in his weakened state? Or was there intrigue in the palace, a plot to remove him and clear the path for others? Each theory has its supporters, yet none can silence the others. The truth may lie in a mixture, for life is rarely simple. A frail body, a sudden accident, a fever that turned deadly, and a court eager to move on could together explain the mystery. What matters is not only how he died, but how he was remembered. In life, Tutankhamun was frail, perhaps overlooked, guided by stronger men. Yet he restored the gods and gave Egypt stability after upheaval. In death, he was buried in splendor, his tomb filled with treasures that preserved his name for eternity. Though erased by successors, he was brought back to life by discovery, and now his death, shrouded in mystery, adds to the fascination that surrounds him. The sudden end of Tutankhamun's life was both a tragedy and a turning point. It ended the direct line of the Amarna dynasty, left Egypt in the hands of ambitious courtiers, and opened the way for the rise of new rulers. Yet in dying young, and in being buried in haste, he was also preserved in a way no other pharaoh was. His death ensured that his tomb would survive almost untouched, and in that survival, his story reached across the ages. The boy who limped on canes, who struggled with pain, who died before his time, became in death the eternal king, the face of ancient Egypt for the modern world. His death, sudden and mysterious, gave birth to a legend, and his frail body became the vessel of immortality. For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun lay in silence within his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His name had been erased from official records, his memory pushed aside by later rulers, and his tomb was small compared to the vast monuments of other pharaohs. Yet by chance his resting place remained hidden, overlooked by thieves and forgotten by history. When it was finally uncovered in the early 20th century, it revealed not only the treasures of a single king, but also a vision of Egypt that dazzled the modern world. The discovery of his tomb turned Tutankhamun from a forgotten boy into the most famous pharaoh of all. The Valley of the Kings lies on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes. It had been chosen centuries earlier as the burial ground for pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Instead of building huge pyramids that could be seen for miles, these kings cut their tombs into the rock of the valley, hidden and guarded. Yet most of these tombs were plundered in antiquity, their treasures stolen, their mummies damaged. Tutankhamun's tomb, by contrast, escaped this fate. Its small size and location, partly hidden beneath later construction, meant it was overlooked by ancient robbers. For centuries it remained sealed, a time capsule of Egypt's golden age waiting for discovery. The man who finally brought it to light was Howard Carter, a British archaeologist working under the patronage of Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy nobleman. Carter had spent years searching in the valley, convinced that Tutankhamun's tomb still lay undiscovered. Many thought he was wasting his time, for the valley had been explored thoroughly and little remained. Yet Carter persisted, guided by fragments of evidence and by his own belief that the boy king had not been found. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon was growing weary of funding the search, but Carter persuaded him to allow one more season. That final effort would change history. On the 4th of November 1922, a young water boy working with Carter's team stumbled upon a stone step cut into the valley floor. As the workers cleared the area, more steps were revealed, leading down to a sealed doorway stamped with the marks of the royal necropolis. Carter realized that he might have found what he had been seeking. Over the following weeks, the entrance was cleared, and by the end of November, Carter stood before a sealed door that had not been opened for thousands of years. With Lord Carnarvon by his side, he made a small hole and peered in by candlelight. When asked if he could see anything, he replied with words that would become famous. Yes, wonderful things. The sight before him was beyond imagination. The first chamber was packed with treasures, stacked in hasty splendor as if the burial had been rushed. Golden couches shaped like lions and bulls stood beside chariots, thrones, and boxes of goods. Everywhere objects glimmered in the dim light, covered with dust but shining with the glow of gold. Further exploration revealed more chambers, each filled with riches. In the burial chamber itself, great shrines of gilded wood stood one within another, enclosing the sarcophagus and coffins of the king. Inside the innermost coffin lay the famous golden mask, covering the face of Tutankhamun, its features calm and eternal. The discovery caused a sensation. Newspapers around the world reported the find, and crowds flocked to see photographs of the treasures. For a world still recovering from the First World War, the splendor of ancient Egypt captured the imagination. Tutankhamun, once forgotten, became a symbol of mystery and wonder. His face, preserved in gold, became one of the most recognized images in history. The contents of the tomb revealed much about Egyptian life and belief. There were beds and chairs for comfort, chariots for travel, weapons for battle, clothing for daily use, and jewelry for adornment. There were also ritual objects, statues of gods, shrines, and amulets to protect the king in the afterlife. Food and wine were placed in jars, ready to sustain him beyond death. Games were included to entertain him, and musical instruments to bring joy. Every item was crafted with skill and beauty, for the afterlife was seen as a continuation of life, and the king would need all that he had enjoyed in this world. The golden mask became the most famous of all these treasures. Made of solid gold inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones, it showed the young king with serene features, his eyes calm, his lips gentle, the Neme's headdress striped with blue, and the cobra and vulture on his brow marking him as Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. This mask was more than a portrait. It was a symbol of eternity, designed to transform the mortal body into a divine form that would last forever. To gaze upon it even today is to feel the presence of a world that has not faded. Among the objects were also items that revealed the more personal side of the king. There were sandals worn by his feet, some decorated with images of enemies, so that each step symbolically crushed them. There were walking sticks worn smooth by use, reminders of his frailty. There were delicate carvings showing him with his queen, scenes of affection and intimacy rare in royal art. These objects show us not only the pharaoh, but also the boy, the human being behind the mask of gold. The tomb also revealed the hurried nature of his burial. Some of the items seem to have been made for others, with inscriptions altered to bear Tutankhamun's name. The walls of the burial chamber were painted with simple scenes, less elaborate than those in other tombs. The space was cramped, with treasures piled almost carelessly, as if time had run out. All of this matched the evidence that his death had been sudden and his burial rushed. Yet even in haste, the wealth and craftsmanship were astonishing. The discovery also sparked tales of a curse. Soon after entering the tomb, Lord Carnarvon died of an infected mosquito bite, and newspapers were quick to link his death to the wrath of the pharaoh. Stories spread that anyone who entered the tomb would suffer misfortune. In truth, most of those involved lived long lives, including Carter himself, who died many years later. Yet the idea of the curse took hold in popular imagination, adding to the mystery of the boy king. Even today the phrase, "the curse of Tutankhamun," remains part of his legend. The treasures were carefully removed and catalogued over the following years, a process that took nearly a decade. Each item was documented, photographed, and transported to museums in Egypt, where they remain among the most prized possessions of human history. The sheer number of objects, more than 5,000, gives us an unmatched view of the wealth and artistry of ancient Egypt. Other tombs had been looted, their contents lost, but Tutankhamun's tomb survived almost intact, providing a unique window into a vanished world. The impact of the discovery went far beyond archaeology. Tutankhamun became a cultural icon, inspiring art, fashion, and literature. His name appeared in songs, his image in films, his mask in posters and souvenirs. Exhibitions of his treasures toured the world in the 20th century, drawing millions of visitors and sparking a renewed fascination with Egypt. The boy king who had been forgotten by his own people became in death the most famous pharaoh of all time. For historians, the tomb provided more than splendor. It offered insights into the daily life of the court, the beliefs of the people, and the practices of burial. It showed the mixture of personal and political in royal life, the way objects of comfort and love were placed beside symbols of power and divinity. It revealed the artistry of craftsmen who could shape gold, stone, and wood into forms of beauty unmatched in the modern world. It showed the devotion of a people who believed that even in death their king must be surrounded by every sign of wealth and power. Yet beyond all this, the discovery of the tomb gave Tutankhamun a second life. His reign may have been short, his achievements modest, his health weak, but his tomb ensured that his name would never fade again. He became a symbol not of weakness but of eternity, a face that spoke of the glory of Egypt and the mystery of time. His story reminds us that history is not always shaped by those who lived the longest or achieved the most. Sometimes it is shaped by those whose lives were cut short, but whose memory endured through chance and discovery. The silence of 3,000 years was broken by the flicker of a candle through a hole in a door, and from that moment the world changed. The boy who had been buried in haste, whose body was frail and whose reign was nearly forgotten, became in death the eternal king. His tomb stands as one of the greatest discoveries in history, a link between past and present, a reminder that even in weakness there can be splendor, and even in death there can be immortality. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 gave the world a glimpse of ancient splendor that had been hidden for millennia. Yet it was not only the treasures that captured the imagination, but also the stories that surrounded them. Among the most powerful of these stories was the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs, a tale that spread rapidly after the death of Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the excavation. Whether based on fear, coincidence, or the need for drama, the curse became part of Tutankhamun's legend, adding mystery to a story already filled with wonder. When Carter first opened the tomb and peered into the darkness by candlelight, he could not have known how far-reaching the discovery would be. Newspapers across the world carried reports of the find, often exaggerating details to feed a hungry public. The image of golden treasures stacked in a hidden chamber fired the imagination. Yet it was not until the sudden death of Lord Carnarvon that the story took on a darker turn. Carnarvon had suffered a mosquito bite on his cheek, which became infected. While shaving, he cut the wound, and infection spread quickly. Within weeks he died in Cairo, far from his home in England, at almost the same time that power in the city went out. Reporters were quick to connect his death with the tomb, declaring that the pharaoh had taken revenge on those who disturbed his rest. From this moment the idea of a curse spread like fire. Newspapers declared that death would come to all who entered the tomb. Stories appeared claiming that ancient warnings had been found carved on the walls, though none in truth existed. The tale grew with each retelling. When Carnarvon's pet dog in England supposedly howled and died at the very moment of his master's death, the curse seemed confirmed in the public mind. Soon every death or misfortune linked to anyone even distantly connected with the excavation was added to the story. In reality, most of those involved lived long lives. Carter himself lived for another 16 years after the discovery, carefully cataloguing the treasures and publishing detailed reports. Many members of the team lived into old age. Yet the myth of the curse had taken root, and facts could not undo it. People preferred the drama of a vengeful pharaoh striking from beyond the grave. The story was retold in books, films, and newspapers, until it became almost as famous as the treasures themselves. Part of the power of the curse lay in the mystery of death itself. The modern world of the early 20th century was fascinated by the occult, by spiritualism, and by tales of ancient secrets. The sudden and exotic death of a wealthy English lord seemed to confirm that there were forces beyond human control. Egypt itself, with its mummies, pyramids, and hieroglyphs, was already steeped in mystery for outsiders. The idea that a curse lay upon the tomb of a king fitted perfectly with the mood of the age. It gave the story of Tutankhamun a sense of danger, of forbidden knowledge, of power that had survived through the ages. The curse also reflected a sense of guilt and fear about disturbing the dead. Ancient tombs had been robbed for centuries, but in the modern age the removal of treasures from museums and collectors raised questions. Was it right to take the goods of the dead, to break open their resting places, to display their bodies and possessions to the world? The idea of a curse seemed like nature's answer, a warning that the past should not be disturbed. Even if the curse was never written on the walls, it was present in the minds of those who looked upon the golden mask and wondered what price had been paid for its discovery. For the Egyptian people themselves, the idea of the curse was more complex. Some saw it as a foreign invention, a story created by Western newspapers to add drama. Others may have felt that there was truth in it, for respect for the dead and fear of their power had long been part of Egyptian culture. To disturb a tomb was to break the barrier between worlds, and though Tutankhamun had been forgotten by name, his spirit may still have been seen as dangerous. In this way, the curse story bridged ancient fears and modern imagination. The legend of the curse grew with each retelling. Writers claimed that Carter himself had found warnings inscribed in the tomb, though he always denied it. Others pointed to the deaths of people only loosely connected with the excavation, building a list of victims that made the curse seem real. Yet, when studied closely, the numbers tell another story. Far from all dying young, most of the team lived on for decades. The curse, then, was not a fact but a myth, a creation of the press and the public, fueled by coincidence and fear. Still, its power cannot be denied. Without it, Tutankhamun's discovery might have remained a great archaeological event. With it, it became a legend. The idea of the curse also found a place in popular culture. Films and novels took up the theme, presenting mummies as vengeful beings rising from their tombs to punish the living. These tales drew directly from the myth of Tutankhamun's curse. The image of the mummy as a figure of horror owes much to the story that began in 1922 with Carnarvon's death. In this way, Tutankhamun shaped not only history but also imagination, his name tied not only to gold and treasure, but also to fear and fascination. Even today, the curse is part of how Tutankhamun is remembered. Tourists who visit his tomb in the Valley of the Kings still hear the story, guides still tell of the deaths, and the image of the vengeful pharaoh still lingers. Though science has explained much, the pull of mystery remains strong. The human mind is drawn to stories of forbidden power, and the curse of the boy king remains one of the most famous of them all. Beyond the curse, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb also shaped the way archaeology was seen. Before 1922, the field was often the domain of the wealthy, more focused on treasure than on knowledge. The publicity surrounding the tomb, combined with the curse story, gave archaeology both glamour and danger. Crowds followed the progress of the excavation as if it were a drama. This attention helped to shape modern methods. As Carter and his team were forced to work carefully, to document everything, to show that they were not simple treasure hunters. In this way, the curse, though false, played a role in shaping the field itself. The fascination with the curse also ensured that Tutankhamun remained in the public eye. Long after the excavation ended, the story of the curse was retold, drawing attention to exhibitions and books. When his treasures toured the world, millions came not only to see the gold, but also to feel the thrill of standing near the boy whose tomb carried such power. In this sense, the curse became part of his immortality, keeping his name alive in ways that his short reign never could have achieved on its own. It is worth remembering that for the ancient Egyptians themselves, the idea of a curse was not strange. Tombs often carried inscriptions calling upon the gods to protect the dead and warning against disturbance. These were not curses in the dramatic sense of the modern story, but they expressed the belief that the resting place of the dead was sacred, and that to break it was to invite punishment. Tutankhamun's tomb carried no such warning, but the belief that the dead held power was deeply rooted in the culture. The modern myth of the curse may therefore be seen as a distant echo of ancient fear, reshaped for a new age. The power of the curse lies not in fact but in feeling. It expresses our unease at death, our fear of disturbing the past, our fascination with the idea that some things are beyond human control. Tutankhamun, the fragile boy who became a king, embodied these themes in life and in death. His treasures dazzled, his death puzzled, and his tomb gave birth to a story that continues to haunt the imagination. The curse may never have existed, yet it is now as much a part of his story as the golden mask or the treasures of his burial. In the end, the curse of Tutankhamun tells us more about ourselves than about him. It shows our hunger for mystery, our need to believe in forces beyond reason, our uneasy relationship with the past. For the people of the 20th century, it gave meaning to a sudden death. For the storytellers, it gave drama, and for the public, it gave a thrill. For Tutankhamun, it gave immortality of another kind, ensuring that his name would never fade again. Thus the boy king, who in life was frail and forgotten, in death became not only the eternal face of Egypt, but also the source of one of the most enduring legends of modern times. His tomb may have been small, his reign short, but his curse, though born of myth, was vast. It spread across the world, shaping stories, inspiring fear, and ensuring that Tutankhamun would never be left in silence again. Tutankhamun's reign was brief, his power limited, and his life cut short. Yet his name endures as one of the most famous in history. This fame is not the result of his achievements in life, but of what followed his death. The discovery of his tomb in 1922 gave the modern world a treasure beyond imagination, and it transformed the boy king into a symbol of ancient splendor. His legacy is one of paradox. He was a forgotten pharaoh, erased from lists of kings, yet he is now the most recognized of them all. He was weak and frail in life, yet in death he is seen as eternal and powerful. His legacy rests not only in the golden treasures of his tomb, but also in the way he has shaped how we see the past. In the years after the discovery, Tutankhamun became more than an archaeological subject. He became an icon. His golden mask, serene and radiant, was reproduced across the world. Images of it appeared in newspapers, on posters, in films, and in museums. To millions, the face of Tutankhamun became the face of Egypt itself. Where once the pyramids of Giza had been the symbol of ancient Egypt, now it was the boy king's mask that spoke most clearly of the mystery and splendor of the Nile. No other ruler, not even the mighty Ramses, achieved such recognition in the modern mind. Part of this legacy lies in timing. The world of the 1920s was hungry for wonder. The First World War had left deep scars, and people longed for beauty and escape. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb arrived like a vision from another world, rich with gold, color, and mystery. The story of a forgotten king whose resting place had survived, untouched for thousands of years, captured imaginations everywhere. The legend of the curse added drama, and soon Tutankhamun was not only a name in history, but a figure in popular culture. Exhibitions of his treasures drew record crowds wherever they traveled. In the 1970s, a global tour of the objects from his tomb brought millions to museums in London, Paris, and New York. People queued for hours to catch a glimpse of the golden mask and the treasures of the boy king. Newspapers spoke of Tutmania, a wave of fascination that touched fashion, music, and art. Jewelry and clothing inspired by Egyptian motifs appeared in shops, songs mentioned his name, and films used his story. Tutankhamun had become not only a pharaoh of the past, but also a figure of the present, shaping culture across the world. For Egypt itself, the discovery of the tomb was a source of pride and power. It reminded the world of the depth and richness of Egyptian history, and placed the country at the center of global fascination. The treasures, housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and later moved to new museums, became symbols of national identity. Tutankhamun was no longer just a boy king. He was a representative of Egypt's greatness, a link between past and present, a reminder that this land had once been the heart of civilization. Yet beyond the fame and glamour, Tutankhamun's legacy is also one of knowledge. The discovery of his tomb provided archaeologists with an unprecedented window into ancient life. Unlike other tombs that had been looted, Tutankhamun's was almost intact. More than 5,000 objects were catalogued, each offering insight into the daily life, beliefs, and artistry of the time. From chariots and weapons to beds and sandals, from amulets and statues to food and wine, the tomb contained everything a king might need in life and in death. This completeness allowed scholars to understand ancient Egypt in a way that no other find had done. The objects showed the blend of the sacred and the personal in Egyptian thought. A simple chair used by the king sat beside shrines to the gods. Sandals worn smooth by his feet lay next to golden thrones inlaid with precious stones. Tiny models of boats and servants promised service in the afterlife, while real jars of food and drink provided sustenance. Even the miscarried daughters buried with him spoke of the human side of the royal family. This mixture of splendor and intimacy gave the world not only a vision of wealth, but also a sense of the humanity of the boy behind the crown. The study of his body has also shaped his legacy. Modern science has allowed us to see beyond the mask and understand the frailty of the young king. DNA tests, CT scans, and medical studies revealed the genetic problems caused by inbreeding, the clubfoot that forced him to rely on canes, the malaria that weakened him, and the injury that may have caused his death. These studies showed that the golden mask hid not only a king but a boy who lived in pain. Far from diminishing his image, this made him more compelling, for it reminded us that even the mightiest of rulers were human. His struggles became part of his story, making his survival, as long as it lasted, remarkable in itself. His legacy also lies in the way he has shaped archaeology. The methods used by Carter, though criticized in later years for damage to the body, marked a turning point. The sheer scale of the discovery forced a new level of care and documentation. Every object was catalogued, photographed, and studied. The attention drawn to the find also raised public interest in archaeology as a serious field rather than a pursuit of treasure hunters. In this sense, Tutankhamun helped to shape the discipline itself, pushing it toward professionalism and respect for knowledge. Tutankhamun's place in the modern imagination has also raised questions about the nature of fame. He achieved little in life compared to other pharaohs. He built no great monuments, fought no great wars, left no children to continue his line. His reign was guided by others, his name erased by successors. By every measure of ancient power, he was a minor king. Yet by the accident of his intact tomb and the splendor of its treasures, he became the most famous of them all. His legacy shows us that history is not always about deeds, but also about memory, about what survives, about what captures the imagination of those who come after. In Egyptology, his legacy is mixed. Some scholars point out that his reign was short, and that his role was more symbolic than real. Others note that his restoration of the old gods marked an important shift after the Amarna period. Yet few deny that his tomb has given more information about ancient life than any other single find. The boy who did little in life gave everything in death. His tomb became the key to understanding a world long vanished. In popular culture, his legacy is vast. The golden mask has become an image known even to those who know little of history. Films about mummies, stories of curses, novels about ancient Egypt all draw in some way from his story. He appears in songs, in plays, in paintings. His name is used for hotels, for businesses, for objects seeking to borrow some of his splendor. He has become not only a king of the past, but a symbol used by the present, a face recognized everywhere. For Egypt, his legacy also brings responsibility. The treasures of his tomb remain among the greatest draws for tourists, and their care is a matter of national pride. Exhibitions of his treasures have traveled the world, but earning funds and attention, but always with the reminder that they are part of Egypt's heritage. Plans for new museums in Cairo and near the pyramids have often focused on giving Tutankhamun's treasures pride of place, ensuring that his name remains central to the story of Egypt's identity. His legacy also reminds us of the power of chance in history. Had his tomb been larger or more obvious, it would likely have been plundered like the others. Had his burial not been rushed, it might have been found and emptied in ancient times. Had Carter not been given one more season, the discovery might have waited decades more. The survival of Tutankhamun's tomb was an accident, but one that changed history. His fame today rests not on what he did, but on what remained, a fragile chain of chance that preserved his memory. The boy king's legacy is also one of emotion, people respond not only to the gold but to the story. A child thrust onto the throne, frail in body, guided by others, dying young, yet remembered forever. His story is both tragic and inspiring. It reminds us that greatness is not always about strength or achievement, but sometimes about survival, about the marks we leave even when we seem small. Tutankhamun's life was brief, yet his death gave him eternity. In schools, in museums, in books and films, Tutankhamun's name continues to inspire curiosity. For many, he is the entry point into the history of Egypt, the figure who first sparks interest in the pyramids, the gods, the temples, and the mysteries of the Nile. His legacy is therefore not only his own, but also the legacy of Egypt itself, for through him millions have come to know and love the story of this ancient land. The enduring fascination with Tutankhamun speaks to a human need for wonder. We are drawn to stories of hidden treasure, of lost kings, of forgotten names brought back to life. Tutankhamun embodies all of these. His tomb was hidden, his reign forgotten, his treasures untouched, and his name restored. He is the perfect blend of mystery, tragedy, and splendor. In him we see both the fragility of human life and the power of memory to overcome time. Thus Tutankhamun's legacy endures. He was a boy who suffered, a king who restored the gods, a ruler whose life was short and whose death sudden. He was erased from history, yet rediscovered and made eternal. His mask shines with the light of the sun, his treasures fill museums, his story fills books. His name echoes in classrooms, and his face gazes calmly across the world. He is the eternal boy, the golden king, the pharaoh who in death achieved what life denied him. His legacy is not only Egypt's but the world's, for through him we are reminded of the beauty, the mystery, and the endurance of human history.